My sister laughed when I walked into her luxury party wearing a $30 dress. Not a polite laugh, either. She looked me up and down in front of nearly 50 people, smiled like she had just been handed the funniest joke of the night, and said, "Guys, this is my little sister. She's the poor one." People laughed because they thought she was joking. She wasn't. I just smiled, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, and said, "It's good to see you too, Claire." What nobody at that party knew was that Claire's husband was about to stand up and say something that would completely change the way everyone in that room looked at me. And honestly, I didn't know whether I wanted him to. My name is Natalie, and for most of my adult life, I've been the sister who learned how to make $50 stretch when Claire could spend $500 without checking her bank account. We grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. Our parents weren't poor, but we weren't wealthy either. Dad owned a commercial supply company that he'd built slowly over 3 decades. Mom handled the books until she retired. Claire was always the outgoing one. She could walk into a room full of strangers and somehow leave with 5 new friends. I was quieter. I liked numbers, spreadsheets, fixing things, and knowing exactly where every dollar went. When we were kids, Claire used to tease me for keeping birthday money in labeled envelopes. "You're such an old lady," she'd say. I didn't mind. I actually liked knowing where my money was. By the time we were teenagers, the difference between us had become obvious. Claire wanted designer clothes, expensive restaurants, and vacations. I wanted college without debt. She got the car our parents helped her buy when she turned 17. I worked weekends at a grocery store and bought my first used car myself. Neither of us thought much about it at the time, or maybe I didn't. Because I always assumed that even if Claire and I lived different lives, we were still sisters. That assumption became harder to maintain after she married Daniel. Daniel was 38, handsome, confident, and extremely successful. He had joined Dad's company after college and eventually became its operations director. Claire met him at a charity event. 6 months later, they were engaged. A year after that, they bought a house that looked like something from a magazine. Not a normal house. I'm talking about a house with 12-foot ceilings, a stone driveway, a pool nobody in our family knew how to maintain, and a kitchen bigger than my entire apartment. Claire loved telling people about it, especially me. "Natalie, you have to see the closet," she'd say. "I've seen it." "No, you haven't really seen it." Then she'd pull me upstairs and open the doors like she was unveiling a museum exhibit. I would laugh. She would laugh. And I'd tell myself it didn't bother me. But somewhere along the way, Claire stopped seeing me as her sister and started seeing me as the family member who had fallen behind. I noticed it in little ways first. She'd introduce me as my sister Natalie. Then she'd add, "She works in accounting." Like that explained my entire existence. If someone asked what I did, I'd answer honestly, "I do financial administration for a logistics company." Claire would smile and say, "She means she's an accountant." I never corrected her. I didn't care enough. At least, I thought I didn't. Then came the party. It was Claire and Daniel's 10th wedding anniversary, and Claire had decided to throw what she called a small family celebration. Small apparently meant a rented catering company, a live jazz trio, custom floral arrangements, an open bar, valet parking, and enough food to feed an entire wedding reception. I almost didn't go. I had just paid an unexpected car repair bill, and I was trying to be careful with money. The dress I owned that looked nicest had a stain on the sleeve, so 3 days before the party, I went to a discount store and bought a navy blue dress for $30. It fit well. It wasn't designer. It wasn't embarrassing. It was just a simple dress. I actually liked it. On the night of the party, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked at myself. "You look fine," I told my reflection. Then, I grabbed my purse and left. I should mention something important. The party wasn't just a party. It was the first time in months that nearly the entire family would be together. Dad was going. Mom was going. Claire and Daniel's friends were going. And several people connected to Dad's business were going. I didn't know why. Claire had only told me, "Daniel wants some people from work there." That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way Mom had sounded on the phone when she reminded me not to miss it. "Your dad really wants everyone there," she said. "Why?" "He just does." I laughed. "Mom, it's Claire's anniversary." "I know. So why does Dad care if I come?" There was a pause. "I don't know, honey." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I wish I had. When I arrived at the house, there were already cars lining both sides of the street. A valet took my keys. I almost apologized for driving a 9-year-old Honda. Then I reminded myself that nobody cared. I walked toward the front door. A woman in a black dress opened it. "Name?" "Natalie Bennett." She smiled professionally. "Enjoy the evening." I stepped inside. The house looked even more extravagant than I remembered. Candles lined the staircase. There were white flowers everywhere. A huge photograph of Claire and Daniel from their wedding was displayed above the fireplace. Claire was wearing a silver dress. Daniel was in a black tuxedo. They looked perfect. Then Claire saw me. Her eyes moved from my face to my dress. She stopped talking to the woman beside her. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she smiled. "Oh my God." I smiled back. "Happy anniversary." She walked toward me. "You actually wore that?" I looked down. "My dress?" She laughed. "I just didn't think you'd take the $30 challenge literally." The woman beside her laughed awkwardly. I felt my face get warm. "It's comfortable," I said. Claire leaned closer. "You could have told me you needed something nicer." "I didn't need anything." "Okay." She looked around. Then she raised her voice slightly. "Everyone, come meet my sister." I knew immediately that something was wrong. People turned. Claire put an arm around my shoulder. "This is Natalie. She's the practical one in the family." A few people smiled. Claire continued, "She shops at places where everything is under $50. Someone laughed. Then she said it. "She's the poor sister." The room went quiet for half a second. Then several people laughed because they thought it was harmless teasing. I didn't laugh, but I didn't react either. I looked at Claire. She was waiting for me to be embarrassed. Instead, I smiled. "Nice introduction." Her smile faltered. "I'm kidding." "I know. You're not mad?" "No." That seemed to disappoint her. She walked away. I stood there holding my water and watched her greet the next group of guests. Mom came over a few minutes later. She hugged me. "Don't let Claire get under your skin." "I'm fine." "You sure?" "Yeah." Mom looked toward Claire, then back at me. "She doesn't always know when she's gone too far." That sentence stayed with me. Because Mom had said something similar before. A lot. She always described Claire's behavior as something I needed to understand, never something Claire needed to change. I wandered toward the back patio. That's when I noticed something strange. Daniel was standing near the pool with 2 men I'd seen before at Dad's company. They were talking quietly. When Daniel saw me, he stopped. One of the men looked at me, then at Daniel, then back at me. I didn't think much of it until Daniel walked over. "Natalie, hey, how are you?" "Good." He glanced at my dress. Not in the same way Claire had. His expression was almost apologetic. Claire's being Claire. I smiled. She always is. He didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "We need to talk later." I frowned. "About what?" "Not here." That was the first moment I felt genuinely uneasy. What happened? Nothing happened. Then why do we need to talk? He looked toward the house. After dinner. Before I could ask anything else, Someone called his name. He walked away. I watched him disappear into the crowd. Something about his expression bothered me. Daniel was usually smooth, controlled. He didn't look controlled. He looked nervous. Dinner was served at 8. I sat between Mom and one of Dad's longtime employees. Claire sat at the head of the table with Daniel. Dad was across from me. For most of dinner, everyone talked about Claire and Daniel's life, their trips, their new investments, their house renovation, their plans for another property. I listened. Then Dad suddenly said, "Natalie, how's work?" I looked up. "Good." "Still with the same company?" "Yeah." Claire smiled. "She's been there forever." 7 years, I said. "See?" Claire laughed. "Forever." Dad nodded. 7 years is a long time. There was something strange about the way he said it. I couldn't explain it. Then Daniel set down his fork. "Actually, Natalie has something to do with the company." Claire looked at him. "What?" Daniel didn't answer. Dad did. "Not tonight." That got my attention. I looked at my father. "What does that mean?" Dad shook his head. "Nothing." Claire looked between us. "Okay, now I'm curious." Daniel gave Dad a warning look. Dad ignored him. Dinner continued, but the mood had changed. I barely tasted my food. Afterward, I went into the kitchen to get some water. That's when I heard voices coming from the hallway. "Dad and Daniel, you said she didn't know." I said I hadn't told her. "And she still doesn't?" "I don't think so." I froze. My hand was still on the refrigerator door. I couldn't hear everything. Then Daniel said something that made my stomach tighten. "She has to be told before Monday." Dad replied, "I know." "Monday? Told what?" I stepped away before they could see me. I went back outside. Claire was standing near the fire pit. She had a glass of champagne in her hand. She looked at me. "Why are you hiding out here?" "I'm not." "You look weird." "I'm tired." She rolled her eyes. "It's always something with you." I stared at her. "Do you ever get tired of doing that?" "Doing what?" "Talking to me like I'm beneath you." She laughed. "Oh, come on." "I'm serious." She took a sip. "Natalie, you're sensitive." "Maybe." "You know I love you." I nodded. "I know." She smiled. "Then don't make everything a competition." I looked at her. "I've never competed with you." She didn't respond. Instead, she said, "You should be proud of me." "I am." "You don't sound like it." "I am, Claire." She looked away. Then she said quietly, "Dad's finally giving us something big." My stomach dropped. "What?" She looked back at me. I didn't say anything. "Giving you what?" "Nothing." She walked away. I stood there alone. A few minutes later, Daniel came outside. He closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." "About what?" He rubbed his forehead. "Your father is going to make an announcement soon." "What kind?" Daniel looked at me. "You deserve to hear it from someone who isn't trying to embarrass you." I waited. "What announcement?" He opened his mouth, then stopped. From inside the house, I heard Dad's voice. "Everyone, could I have your attention?" Daniel closed his eyes. I looked through the glass doors. Everyone was gathering around my father. Claire stood beside him. Mom was near the fireplace. Jason wasn't there because he lived in California. But Matthew had come. Dad held a folder in his hand. I walked inside. He looked directly at me. For the first time that night, he didn't look like my father. He looked like a businessman preparing to make a difficult decision. "There's something the family needs to know," he said. Claire smiled. Daniel looked at me, and I suddenly understood why everyone had been acting strangely all night. Dad opened the folder. "This concerns the family business." Nobody spoke. I felt my pulse in my throat. Dad looked at me again. Then, he said my name. Natalie, you should probably sit down. I didn't. I stayed standing, because whatever was inside that folder had something to do with me. And, judging by the look on Daniel's face, I was about to find out why he had been nervous all evening. Dad pulled the folder closer to himself. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The music was still playing softly in the background. Someone near the kitchen laughed, completely unaware that the mood around our table had changed. Claire folded her arms. Dad, what is this? Dad didn't look at her. He looked at me. Natalie, your mother and I should have told you about this years ago. My stomach tightened. About what? He opened the folder. There were several pages inside, all neatly organized. Contracts, financial statements, copies of old corporate documents. A few pages had sticky notes attached to them. Claire leaned forward. Dad, seriously, what is going on? Daniel finally spoke. Maybe we should do this somewhere private. Dad looked at him. No. That one word made Daniel go quiet. Dad turned another page. The family business isn't just mine. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Dad took a breath. It was never entirely mine. I stared at him. I honestly thought I'd misunderstood. Carter Manufacturing had been in our family for decades. Dad had taken over after Grandpa retired. Claire and I had grown up hearing about it at holidays, birthdays, and Sunday dinners. Claire had always been the one Dad talked about bringing into the company. I was the one who wasn't interested enough. At least, that's what everyone thought. Dad looked at me. Your grandfather left part of the company to Natalie. Claire's face changed. What? I couldn't speak. Dad continued. When Grandpa died, his will divided his ownership differently than most people knew. He left me 60%. He paused. And Natalie, 40%. The room seemed to go completely silent. Claire actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because she couldn't process it. That doesn't make any sense. It does, Dad said quietly. Why would Grandpa leave her 40%? Dad looked down at the documents. Because he believed she would understand what the business was supposed to become. Claire stared at me. I could see the question forming in her eyes. If that was true, why had nobody told me? I finally found my voice. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? He looked at me for a long time. Because I thought you were too young. I've been an adult for years. I know. Then why? Dad's expression tightened. Because your grandfather put conditions on your ownership. I looked at the folder. What conditions? Dad slid one document across the table. I picked it up. It was an old trust agreement. My name was printed near the top. My hands started shaking. I read the first few lines, then looked back at Dad. What does this mean? It means your 40% wasn't supposed to become fully active until you turned 30. Claire immediately jumped in. Then she doesn't own 40% now. Dad shook his head. No. She owns it. Claire's face went pale. The voting rights activate when she turns 30, Dad explained. Until then, I manage them as trustee. I looked at Daniel. He hadn't moved. And suddenly, I understood why he'd been nervous. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. I turned toward him. You knew about this? Daniel swallowed. I knew there was an ownership issue. Claire looked at him. You knew? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Dad did. I told Daniel because he became involved with the company's legal and financial planning last year. Claire stood up. You told my husband before you told me? Dad's voice remained calm. Claire, you weren't involved in the company. She stared at him. Then she looked at me. So, all this time. I didn't know what to say. She shook her head. No, this is ridiculous. I felt something inside me shift. For years, Claire had called me the poor one, the irresponsible one, the sister who never had anything, the one who needed help. And now, we were sitting in a house she had spent years treating like proof that she had won some imaginary competition between us. But apparently, money had never told the whole story. Dad turned another page. There was one more part of Grandpa's arrangement. What? He wanted Natalie to work outside the company for at least 5 years before she could exercise certain rights. I stared at him. Dad continued. He believed she needed to build a life that wasn't dependent on this family. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly, so many things made sense. Grandpa had always treated me differently. When I was 16, he'd asked what I wanted to do after high school. I'd said I wasn't sure. He'd told me, "That's okay. Just make sure whatever you choose belongs to you." At the time, I thought it was just something an old man said. Now I realized he had known exactly what he was talking about. Claire sat back down. Her face had lost all its color. "But why didn't you tell her?" she asked Dad. Dad looked at me. "Because your grandfather also told me not to." I frowned. "What?" "He didn't want you growing up thinking you had a safety net." I stared at the documents. That was the first part of the night that actually hurt. Not because I suddenly discovered I was wealthy, but because the entire story I'd told myself about my place in my family had just cracked open. I had spent years believing I wasn't important. Maybe Grandpa had known that if I'd been told I owned part of the company, I would have grown up differently. Maybe he wanted me to become someone who didn't need that information to believe in herself. Dad closed the folder halfway. "There is something else." I looked at him. "What?" "The 40% isn't just an investment." He turned the folder around. "It's protected." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Protected from what?" Dad looked at her. "From being transferred without Natalie's approval." Claire didn't understand. I did. "Meaning nobody can sell my shares?" "Correct." "And nobody can use them as collateral?" "Correct." "And nobody can give them to someone else?" Dad nodded. "Correct." I sat back. For the first time that evening, I looked around Claire's beautiful house differently. The expensive furniture, the crystal glasses, the designer dress she had worn, the guests she'd invited, the way she'd laughed when she introduced me as the poor one. Suddenly, the humiliation felt smaller, not because it hadn't hurt. It had, but because I realized she had been judging the wrong thing. Daniel cleared his throat. "Natalie, there's something you need to know about the company." I looked at him. "What?" He glanced at Claire, then at Dad. "The company is struggling." Claire frowned. "What?" Dad nodded. "Revenue has been down for 18 months. Claire stared at him. "How bad?" Dad hesitated. "Bad enough that the board has been discussing restructuring." I looked at the folder. "So, why are we celebrating?" Dad didn't answer. Daniel did. "Because there's a potential buyer." I remembered the way he'd been acting all night. The nervousness. The constant checking of his phone. The private conversations with Dad. The way he had avoided looking at me. I looked at him. "Who?" He hesitated. Dad finally answered. "A private investment group." Claire looked relieved. "So the company is being sold?" Dad nodded. "Possibly." I frowned. "Why does this involve me?" Dad's eyes met mine. "Because your 40% has to be dealt with before any sale can happen." Everything went quiet again. Claire stared at me. "So she can block the sale?" Dad nodded. "Yes." Claire stood up. "You're kidding!" "No." She turned toward me. "Natalie, don't." I blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't make this difficult." I almost smiled. "I don't even know what you're asking me to do." Claire's voice softened. "We've all worked hard to get here." I looked at her. "You?" She froze. Dad stepped in. Claire. No, Dad. She looked at me. You know what I mean. I did. She wasn't talking about the business. She was talking about the life she thought she had built. The house. The parties. Image. The status. Everything depended on a company she hadn't even realized was partly mine. Daniel finally spoke. Claire, you need to calm down. She looked at him. Why are you defending her? I'm not defending anyone. You've been acting weird all night. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Because I knew this conversation was coming. She stared at him. You knew? I knew the ownership documents existed. You knew Natalie owned 40%? Daniel looked at me. Yes. Claire's eyes filled with disbelief. And you didn't tell me? I couldn't. Why? Because it wasn't my information to share. That answer made Claire furious. You're my husband. I know, and she's your wife's sister. I know. Then why did you keep this from me? Daniel looked down. Because your father asked me not to. Claire turned toward Dad. You trusted him more than me? Dad's voice was quiet. I trusted him to follow the agreement. That was when I finally understood something important. This wasn't a surprise Dad had created tonight. He had known for years. Daniel had known for at least a year. And Claire had known nothing. I suddenly felt incredibly tired. I looked at Dad. Why bring this up tonight? He took a long breath. Because you told me last month that you were thinking about moving to Chicago. I nodded. I was. I knew that. So? If you moved, I couldn't keep managing your ownership indefinitely. I stared at him. You could have called me. I should have. Yes. Dad looked genuinely ashamed. I made a lot of mistakes with you, Natalie. I didn't answer. That was the first time I had ever heard him say it. Not imply it. Not soften it. Actually say it. He continued. I spent too many years assuming Claire was the daughter who would carry the family name. Claire looked hurt. And I wasn't? Dad looked at her. You were never interested in the business. That doesn't mean I didn't care. I know. He looked at me. But Natalie did. I swallowed hard. The truth was, I hadn't even realized I cared about the business until I started working there. I'd taken a part-time job in the warehouse when I was 22 because I needed money. Then I started helping with inventory. Then accounts payable. Then vendor contracts. Then purchasing. I learned the company piece by piece. Nobody celebrated any of it. But I learned, and eventually, I knew the business better than almost anyone. Dad had never called that leadership. He called it helping out. Claire had never called it work. She called it Dad keeping you busy. I looked at her now. Do you remember when I spent 3 months fixing the supplier issue that almost shut down the Cleveland warehouse? Claire said nothing. Dad told everyone Jason solved it. Dad closed his eyes. I remember. And when I negotiated the insurance renewal that saved the company almost $200,000? Dad nodded. You did that. Matthew got the bonus. Dad's face tightened. I know. And when I stayed overnight at the office because payroll software crashed? Claire whispered. I didn't know that. I looked at her. That's the point. She looked down. For once, she didn't have anything to say. Daniel pushed the folder toward me. There are more documents. I looked at him. Why are you giving them to me? Because they're yours. I opened the folder. There were board minutes, financial statements, shareholder records, and then I saw something that made my chest tighten. A letter from Grandpa. It was dated 2 months before he died. My name was written on the envelope. I looked at Dad. You never gave me this. He shook his head. I was supposed to give it to you when you turned 30. My hands trembled. Why? because that was his instruction. I opened the letter. There wasn't much, just a few paragraphs. Grandpa wrote that money could give a person options, but it couldn't give them character. He wrote that he had watched me work quietly while everyone else chased recognition. And then there was one line that made me stop. He said he hoped that one day I would stop trying to earn a place at a table where I had always belonged. I had to put the letter down. For years, I had thought I was trying to prove I deserved to be in my own family. Grandpa had apparently known. He had seen it. Dad looked at me. I should have given you that years ago. Yes. I was wrong. I nodded. That didn't erase anything. But it mattered. Claire wiped her eyes. I didn't know. I looked at her. I know. She shook her head. No, Natalie. I really didn't. She looked around the room. Dad made me think I was the one. Dad looked down. I did. Claire laughed bitterly. So, what am I supposed to do with that? Nobody answered. After a few seconds, she looked at me. Do you hate me? The question caught me off guard. No. After tonight? I thought about it. I don't hate you. She waited. But I don't want to pretend what you did was okay. Her eyes filled with tears. I was embarrassed. You embarrassed me. I know. I was wearing a $30 dress. I know. You made sure everyone knew. She looked down. I thought you were jealous of me. I wasn't. I know that now. I shook my head. I wasn't jealous of your house, Claire. I was hurt that my own sister needed everyone to believe she was better than me. She started crying quietly. Daniel put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Dad closed the folder. There is still a business decision to make. I looked at him. What decision? Whether you want to keep your shares? I thought about it. For years I had imagined someday proving myself to my family. Now I realized I didn't want that. I wanted something simpler. I wanted to decide my own life. I'll keep them. Dad nodded. I thought you might. But I'm not coming into the company. He looked surprised. You aren't? No. I looked at the folder. I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to make you see me. Dad's eyes became wet. That isn't what I want. Maybe not now. I stood. But it was what you wanted for a very long time. He didn't argue. That was probably the hardest part. The next morning, I met with the company's attorney. Everything was explained to me in plain English. My ownership was legitimate. The trust was legitimate. My voting rights were approaching the point where I would have full control over my shares. And the company wasn't going anywhere. I decided to leave my 40% invested for the time being. I didn't need to sell. I didn't need to prove anything. I simply wanted the freedom Grandpa had intended for me. Dad stepped down from day-to-day operations 6 months later. Jason eventually admitted he wasn't interested in running the business. Matthew stayed, but only after agreeing to work under an independent management team instead of being handed a position because he was Dad's son. And Claire? Our relationship took longer, much longer. She apologized. Not once, several times. The first few apologies sounded like guilt. The later ones sounded different. She stopped talking about money. She stopped comparing our lives. And one afternoon, almost a year after the party, she showed up at my apartment carrying a small paper bag. I brought you something. I opened it. Inside was a simple framed photograph of the two of us when we were kids. We were sitting on the porch of our grandparents' old house. Claire was holding my hand. I looked at the picture. I don't remember this. She smiled sadly. I do. She sat down. I think I spent years trying to become the sister everyone would envy. I looked at her. And I spent years trying to become the sister Dad would finally notice. She nodded. Neither of us really won. I smiled faintly. No. We sat there for a while. Then she said something I never expected. You know what hurts the most? What? I spent all that money trying to make people think I had a perfect life. She looked at me. And you were the one person who never cared. I laughed quietly. I cared. About me? Yes. She smiled. I know. We weren't magically close after that. Real life doesn't work that way. There were still awkward moments. Old wounds don't disappear because somebody finally says the right thing. But we started again. Slowly, honestly. As for Dad, things changed too. He didn't suddenly become the perfect father, but he stopped assuming. When he wanted my opinion, he asked. When he disagreed, he explained why. And when he introduced me to people, he stopped saying I was helping with the business. He simply said, "This is my daughter, Natalie. She knows the company better than anyone." The first time he said it, I almost cried. Not because I needed his approval anymore, but because I remembered how long I'd waited for it. A year after that party, I went back to the same house. Claire had invited me for Thanksgiving. I walked into the living room wearing the same kind of clothes I always wore. Nothing expensive. Nothing designed to impress anyone. Claire looked at me and smiled. "No comments on your outfit this year." I laughed. Good. She hugged me, and for the first time in a very long time, it didn't feel like we were competing. Later that night, Dad found me standing alone on the back porch. He came outside. "You okay?" "Yeah." He stood beside me. After a minute, he said, "I used to think success meant making sure your children had more than you did." I looked at him. "And now?" "Now, I think success is knowing when to stop deciding who they should become." I smiled. "That sounds like Grandpa." Dad laughed softly. Probably why I didn't understand it until now. We stood there quietly. I thought about the party. The $30 dress. Claire's laughter. The guests watching me. The folder. The ownership documents. And the strange truth that had been sitting inside my family for decades. I had spent so much of my life believing I was the poor sister because I didn't have the things Claire had. The house. The clothes. The lifestyle. The attention. But that night taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Being underestimated can hurt. Being humiliated can stay with you. But neither one gets to decide who you are. I never needed to become richer than Claire. I never needed to embarrass her back. I never needed to stand in that room and prove I was worth more. I only needed to stop measuring my worth by the way other people looked at me. That $30 dress wasn't the cheapest thing in the room that night. It was just the thing everyone noticed. What they didn't notice was that I had spent years building a life I could actually live with. And honestly, that's worth a lot more than a price tag.